Um, okay, so the reflections that follow are part of a larger project in which I seek to investigate kinship as a privileged site where nature and hegemonic power come into collision in classical antiquity, and further to demonstrate how a phenomenological approach to phusis, that is, in a specifically Greek idea of nature, might assist in this project. But today my aim is more modest. I would like to consider the Greek concept of genos in relation to phusis on the one hand and technê on the other. Genos carries a range of meanings from lineage, breed, kinship, race or gender to kind or type in the general sense. So I want to ask, where does Genos stand in the phusis technê schema? To what extent is it a way of or a framework for encountering phusis? And to what extent might it also be understood as a kind of knowledge in relation to human making, that is, as a sort of technology or set of techniques with a particular kind of aim? It might be objected here that nomos is the more appropriate opposition to phusis here than techne. And surely it's the case that genos, like custom or law, is a way of organizing human relations. However, in the sophistical tradition, nomos generally will refer to laws of the polis, while genos, of course, refers to the realm of the oikos. Genos also indicates a certain means of thinking about the natural world, and is germane to techniques of animal husbandry, as well as serving to organize human reproduction over generations. So it's this dimension of genos I wish to foreground today, especially as in its later usage, genos in philosophical context comes to mean kind or type. In this way, it comes to form an epistemic ground or tool for classification, and thus is a kind of technical operation or tool or technique for organizing knowledge. The familiar distinction between technê and phusis from Aristotle, namely that technê has an exterior aim and source of motion within the craftsman, while phusis maintains its telos, eidos, and archekineseos internally, is perhaps a little difficult to apply in this current case, since kinship structures referred to by Genos are not deliberately invented by a craftsman to solve a particular problem, but rather arise, we might say, spontaneously or unconsciously. They're the kind of thing that we're sort of born into rather than something that we sort of make deliberately. Nonetheless, Genos is certainly also a product of human making and functions to uphold certain aims. For example, we may discern that Genos secures paternity in a way that nature does not, and that within patrilineal and patriarchal kinship, it therefore serves to overwrite, in a sense, the corporeality of the female body with the symbolic demands of masculine rule. I mean, I think the name, the patronym sort of illustrates that above all. In what follows, I want to trace some of the evidence for these claims and also point to some areas of instability within Genos in which this demand of paternal rule, which may or may not turn out to be precisely a technical demand, may be seen to break down. My primary interest in Genos then is as a way of designating genealogy, taking sex or gender as a kind of lens or optic that divides and structures the notion of Genos itself. Since our word gender is derived from Genos, we might say that Genos is thus apprehended via Genos, through both a phenomenological genealogical investigation on the one hand and a symbolic classificatory operation on the other. It may be strictly impossible to finally tease these dimensions apart, but it's important to note here that a sex-gender distinction is both put to work and dismantled at the same time in this analysis. What we might call sex, and indeed sexual difference, I maintain, is not reducible to Genos in its classificatory symbolic dimension, but perhaps may be apprehended via genos, understood in its visceral, factical, phenomenological dimension. Note that I'm strenuously avoiding the language of biology here. Perhaps it might be appropriate in the Greek sense of biology as a logos of bios, coming to language of life or living things. However, I want to avoid the language of modern science in this project. You know, I mean, of course, we can talk about, you know, genetics and sperm and, you know, eggs and, you know, all of the kind of facts of sexual and biological reproduction, but here I'm more interested in the Greek idea of a kind of apprehension of natural processes rather than this sort of compositional approach of science, insofar as this a language of science carries the promise of full knowability of a region of being in its nature, essence, composition, or structure. So I'm interested primarily in the phenomenological apprehension of sexual difference at the level of kinship or genos, in which the truth of genos itself, if genos indeed can ever be something self-same, that is, the truth of heredity, is at issue. So how has genos been traditionally understood? Well, in the 19th and early 20th century, historians of antiquity such as Fustel de Coulanges and Gustave Glotz related to the Roman gens and saw in it an archaic form of social organization rooted in family ties that later gave rise to the larger units of phratry and foulée or tribe. In Stage's style, as reflected in the work of Henry Louis Morgan and Friedrich Engels, they understood ancient Greek history as driven by a confrontation between genos and the state, a developmental history that culminates in the institution of the polis. But Felix Bourriaud's monumental 1970s study of Greek genos disabuses us of these assumptions. He surveys the vast array of usages in ancient Greek texts of all kinds, and he demonstrates that there's really no evidence that genos denoted a significant unit of archaic social organization. In the first instance, rather, genos denotes lineage, stock, breeding. It is as applicable to animals as to people. In the human sphere, genos anthropon will refer to kinship and ancestry, family identity. Further, genos will come to mean kind, type, a means of classification or typology, an order. Bourriaud concludes that despite the great variety of senses which the term may bear, these two meanings predominate. First, that of an individual's birth and lineage. It may refer to nothing more than 3 generations issuing from a single ancestor. And that's important, I think, this notion of the 3 generations, because it speaks to something experiential, right? Not something sort of abstract and theoretical. And as such, this meaning takes up a temporal perspective. Second, we have a static sense, one found especially in the texts of philosophy, that of a classificatory category, a kind or type. Certainly the philosophical notion of the natural kind is centrally at stake in this territory, but I hesitate before moving too quickly to this as an adequate definition for genos. Kinship is, after all, a site where both the socio-political and natural elements of human life are intermingled, negotiated, and brought into uneasy, always contested formations. I want to be clear here that by natural, I do not mean something that we could, I think I've already covered this, but just to say it quickly again, that we could easily designate by the term biology. Its nature is not an essence that could be discovered through philosophical investigation, nor an object of study whose secrets might be uncovered by methods of the biological or physical sciences. Neither is it something simply independent of us and beyond our ability to know, perhaps figured as a stable ground or reserve, which is only taken up and knowable through human practices and social and linguistic constructions. Rather, my project develops a notion of nature through a phenomenological understanding of phusis as coming into appearance, insofar as phusis is derived from the Greek verb phuomai, to grow, to beget, or to be born. For our present purposes, what I mean by natural are those phenomena that incontrovertibly appear as part of our corporeal existence. Those elements of life we share with many other organisms: birth, growth, sexuality, reproduction, senescence, and death, factical phenomena replete with existential significance. Aristotle's word for coming to be by nature is by no means accidentally genesis, from gignomai, to come to be, and also related to genos. The significant contrast here is with the poiesis that denotes what comes to be or is made by human activity via technê. Thinking of kinship as genos again might also work to confound that distinction, insofar as it is a site where the hegemonies of socio-political life, made exclusively by humans, come into collision with those that show themselves to us at the levels of the natural, corporeal, and existential. So much then for the natural side of genos. On the socio-political side, genos may not constitute a stable form of social organization, but it's not by any means devoid of socio-political import. Genos is central to the self-understanding of Athenians as autochthonous beings, that is, as beings originally born from their native soil, and key for elitist formations of nobility in the form of the eupatrids and other prominent lineages. In Plato's Menexenus, this autochthony is further posited as foundational to the city's political life. As told by Aspasia in that dialogue, the common rootedness in Athenian soil, the isogonia, or equality of birth, provides a natural basis for isonomia, the equality before the law of Athenian citizens. In this way, genos undergirds the social, political, and legal status of the politeis, the citizen of the polis. Here we glimpse its symbolic side, the guarantee that comes with the name of the father and the laws of heredity. We just might want to quickly note there that, when Pericles makes his citizenship law in 451 BCE, the law says that both mother and father have to be of the citizen class, but the mother, of course, is never actually a citizen. So it's the father of the mother who's being drawn on there in that idea of heredity. So Athenian heredity is a fully patrilineal there. We will see in a short while how this masculine side of genos is developed in the archaic texts of Homer and Hesiod, alongside genos in its maternal feminine aspect, and how these two sides come into conflict in the texts of tragedy. The distinction between oikos, site of genos, and polis is explored most directly in tragedy, as we know well from Hegel's dialectical reading of Antigone. Here, these two orders are explicitly opposed, figured as they are not only as family and state, but as two different orders of law, divine and human, respectively governed over by women and men. Genos appears here once again in two registers. It is one side of a divide that is opposed to polis, but it may also denote gender as a category, much like the German Geschlecht, and thus refer to the apportionment of domains on the side of male and female, respectively. Indeed, in this categorial mode, Aristotle in the Rhetoric refers to linguistic gender as genos. Genos thus designates one side of a gender divide, in that genos polis or oikos polis distinction, namely that of the family, the realm of the feminine, but may also denote both sides, the female and male, and beyond this, as Aristotle's Rhetoric shows us, the three linguistic genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. In its categorical function, Genos pushes towards the activity of pure abstraction, of the operation of a technical categorization, which permits a fantasy of a view from nowhere in which all instances, all kinds, all types receive a full and clear accounting, but which also in reality colludes in a certain never stable apportionment and othering. The association of Genos with the side of women specifically is reinforced by Hesiod, who relates how Pandora, the first mortal woman, is commissioned by Zeus, crafted by Hephaestus out of earth, perfected by Athena, and given wiles by the trickster Hermes. As such, she becomes the origin of the Genos Gunaikon, the race of women, cursed, deceptive, and an evil for men to endure. Pandora, in turn, is by origin the product of technê, craft, rather than genesis or natural coming to be, and thus has no genos of her own. She founds a genos without having a genealogy, and in this way, the centrality of women to any notion of lineage is obfuscated and confounded. And here I'm referring to the concrete facticity that we are all born of a womb. Phusis here is utterly subsumed by technê. As Nicole Leroux argues in The Children of Athena, humans, anthropoi, are sometimes referred to as a genos or race in the tradition in order to separate them from gods, but men never are as such. There is no genos androne or race of men. Genos is never used of the men who make up the Athenian polis, who are thus rendered a whole, a reading that Hegel's analysis of the movement of ethical spirit towards the universal would support. In its technical and political function, then, Genos classifies, particularizes, and splits some kinds, in this case women, from the whole. Let us return, however, to the mythographic sites where Genos, in the temporal sense, in the sense of lineage, finds its fullest articulation, namely those of tragedy. Both the Oedipus cycle and the Oresteia follow the tribulations of Genos over a span of 3 generations. Orestes' grandfather, Atreus, on learning of his brother's Thyestes' adulterous relationship with his wife, kills Thyestes' sons by way of revenge and cooks their bodies, serving them to Thyestes as a feast. His son, Agamemnon, is in turn cuckolded by his brother, Aegisthus, and betrayed by his wife, Clytemnestra. The new couple, Aegisthus and Clytemnestra, kill Agamemnon, and, as we know, Orestes, son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, avenges his father's death by killing his mother. So this is just a way to kind of say, look, there's kind of crimes and pollutions that happen, you know, at the level of Genos, which are the sort of engine of tragedy. But what specifically drives the story, at least in Aeschylus's version, is Agamemnon's earlier murder of his and Clytemnestra's daughter, Iphigenia. Clytemnestra's fury is not simply that of a resentful, unfaithful wife, but of a mother whose daughter is murdered by her father. Here, the confrontation set up is that between the claims of a genealogical order on the side of women and the claim of Orestes to avenge his father. One is tempted to say that the true subject of tragedy is less gender trouble than Genos trouble. Gender is riven by, and thus in a sense constituted by, conflicting orders of Genos. The whence given by Genos is of supreme importance to the Greeks. Its decisiveness made acute by all its attendant anxieties, which are manifested in the contestations and the almost limitless scope for misrecognition it proffers. This is arguably the very substance of tragedy. I suppose this is kind of what I'm trying to say, the substance of what I'm trying to say, that, you know, this kind of technical side of Genos makes something stable that is always subject to kind of slippage and misrecognition. So Genos, hypostatized and static, made into a noun, a genre, a gender, a family, tribe, or race, a genus, a kind, a typology, a classification, or an order cannot but betray its precariousness, founded upon nothing but the continual transformations of becoming, the umbilical flows of blood, the sexual flows of ejaculate, the nourishing flow of milk, the flow of tears in mourning and other bodily liquids. The successions of generations springing forth is echoed in the earth's fecundity, in a mirroring mimesis of becomings surging through time. On the one side of Genos, women, bleeding, birthing, nourishing, mourning, and on the other, fatherhood, delicately anchored in a fleeting sexual act, consolidated by the phantasmatic persistence of words, names, and symbols, techniques that provide an always slippery assurance of legacy through time. The earliest Homeric appearance of Genos comes at the close of Book 2 of the Iliad. We are learning of the vast range of allies collected on the Trojan plain, speaking 1,000 different tongues. Genealogy is everywhere. The names of the warriors, their parentage and forefathers, the most noble issuing from divine provenance. These litanies give us not only the warriors' ancestry, but also dwelling places, the agricultural and geological riches of their surroundings, the mountains that shelter them, the animals that bore them to Troy, the waters that quench them, the rivers that carve out and replenish their landscape, and the fauna they share life with. Here is the first usage of Genos in the corpus. Pylaemenes led his Paphlagonians out of Enetian country, land of the breed of wild mules, and there the word for breed is Genos. The men who held Cytorus and lived in range of Sesamus, building their storied halls along the Parthenius River. So this is just to sort of give a sense of what I've just been saying about this kind of litany of the origins of tribes here. Really giving a sense of the great variety of kinds of people who are collected on the Trojan plain. The genealogy of heroes is thus allied with the genos of beasts and finds itself embedded in the natural world, the world of phusis. This embeddedness of men in the natural world points to an earlier linguistic differentiation noted by the linguist Emile Benveniste, who argues that the Indo-European root of aren, male or masculine, ers, is quite different from the word for sire used in animal husbandry, wers, which instead can be linked to the concept of rain as a fertilizing liquid. So you've got this side of, so Benveniste is arguing against a tradition that says these are either essentially the same root or the same word. He says there's no linguistic evidence for these being, philological evidence for these being the same root, which I think is a really sort of, sort of key point here. So for Benveniste, the word aren, referring to human males, is also, or this ers root, is used of gods and leaders, symbolic fathers, and thus has an abstract and symbolic function in human life, quite separate from the natural function of paternity. And on the other hand, there's no such split on the female side, right? The root of female, or thelu, de, has no such split and remains identical in either arena. So I think we can see how Leroux's point here is consolidated, that despite the Homeric embedding of masculine heroes in their physical environments, the splitting of the masculine function into a natural one associated with animals on the one hand, and a symbolic ruling function turns Genos into a kind of technê which may be applied by men to others, right, animals, women, etc., but to which they are in turn not subjected. So these heroic genealogies in Homer find their divine counterpart in Hesiod's Theogony, the genealogy of the gods. Hesiod relates the origins of, quote, the holy race, Genos, the holy Genos of immortals, who always are, Aein Aeon tone. Here in this short formulation, the contradiction between becoming, gignomai, and being, enai, that will trouble the birth of metaphysics from the start might be discerned. Genos is, after all, a noun form of the verb gignomai and also related to gone, seed. Here is the paradox. The gods who exist forever, in aeon tone, have a lineage, parentage, and a temporal origin. Plato, in the Laws, will reject the Hesiodic theogony in no uncertain terms, telling us we ought not to embrace the accounts of parents such as Hesiod. Like Oedipus, Zeus, and Kronos before him, he defies this paternal authority, and in doing so exemplifies what fathers and sons do, following to the letter the law of defiance against the father, a law of castration, parricide, and substitution, also set down by Genos. The son, according to this law, must replace the father and cannot be added to him nor sit beside him. The theogony, after all, relates that Kronos hated his father Uranus, who hates his children in turn. When Uranus spreads himself over Gaia, Kronos, with Gaia's assistance, castrates him with a jagged sickle. The son defies the father, and in so doing, exemplifies and thus demonstrates his fidelity to paternal Genos via parricide and substitution. But as Hesiod then demonstrates, he cannot stop the flow of the dismembered organs, the blood, quote, the bloody drops that gushed forth earth received, end quote. Thus are born from earth and the blood of castration, the Furies, nymphs and giants, monstrous and feminine banes, lures and enemies of Olympian gods and Greek heroes. The giants, the gigantes, are literally those of the order of becoming, of gignesthai, of Genos. And as the castrated organs fall into the sea, white foam, aphron, emerges around them, out of which is born Aphrodite, foam-born, Aphrogenea, destined to cause havoc by promising Helen to Paris. Such beauty always necessarily also exceeding and threatening the proprieties of marriage and kinship. Quote, and with her went Eros, and comely desire followed her at her birth at the first, and as she went into the assembly of the gods. This honor she has had from the beginning, and this is the portion allotted to her amongst men and undying gods. The whisperings of maidens and smiles and deceits with sweet delight and love and graciousness, end quote. So I just wanting to say that, you know, that even that purer side of the castration of Uranus and ends up sort of giving birth to the goddess Aphrodite, and yet she also stands as a kind of threat to this sort of paternal organ of order of Genos. So on the one hand, then, the theogony gives us the genealogy of Gaia, generating, fecund, parthenogenetic, self-sufficient earth. On the other hand, this generative power on the side of the feminine is necessarily accompanied by deceit, cunning, something evil, and must be taken, subdued, mastered, incorporated, as Zeus swallows Metis, goddess of guile, or seeded from without by a male progenitor. The drama that ensues seems to me to animate the whole of Greek life, and one of its names is the Oresteia. The pollutions of blood, the deformations of Genos, are at the heart of tragic destiny, and they set Genos against Genos, maternal blood against paternal name. Genos in the Oresteia is at first used to signify the house of Atreus. As we've heard, Atreus feeds Thyestes' children to him, brother pollutes brother with his offspring as nourishment, an unthinkable circuitry. Aegisthus, the surviving son, knows that the meal will prove fatal to his Genos, that his line is cursed. The chorus asks, quote, who can cast out from the house its accursed brood, Gonan? The Genos is bound for ruin, end quote. Cassandra, however, senses another order to come, a counter-Genos at work at the heart of the story. Enter the Furies, kindred, sun gonon, and gorged on human blood. In the libation bearers, the second play of the cycle, Orestes echoes Hesiod and tells us that the Furies are brought to pass from paternal blood, for the dark bolt of infernal powers who were stirred by kindred Gené victims calling for vengeance and madness and groundless terrors out of the night, torment and harass a man, end quote. There's this sort of abyssal sense, right, on the side of sort of natural, visceral, bloody Genos, feminine Genos. Another deformation here, the Furies are the offspring not begotten by Uranus's genitals, but from the very blood of the wound that cuts off his paternal generative power. They are the result of masculine genealogical potency cut short, offspring of the wound and trauma of castration. As they are the result of blood rather than sperm, their paternal origin is marked by something feminine in the father, his failure, wound, and deformation, gender trouble as Genos trouble. In the final play, the Eumenides, this excessive, dangerous, fluid, and feminine dimension of Genos is made clear. The Eumenides begins with the speech of the Pythia, the priestess at Delphi, and relates a feminine genealogy of Delphic prophets, Gaia, Themis, Phoebe. Phoebe, however, will transfer the oracle to the charge of the male god, Phoebus Apollo, as a gift in celebration of his birth, Genethlios. We know how the story ends with the Furies representing the feminine order of Genos, defending Clytemnestra's right to avenge her daughter Iphigenia through the murder of Agamemnon. The sacrifice of Iphigenia by Agamemnon, a cruel slaughter undertaken at the behest of Artemis for the sake of favorable winds for the Trojan War, in which she is gagged and reduced to the status of an animal. This act may indeed be read as a sacrifice of the order of Genos for the sake of the city and war. And I hope I've made it clear that I'm deliberately opposing polis to Genos here rather than its more traditional counterpart, oikos. The Furies on the side of Clytemnestra and Iphigenia, the maternal Genos, are pitched against Orestes and Apollo. Apollo, usurper of Delphi, who in his argument cleverly undermines the heretofore undeniable fact of maternal parentage with his assertion that a mother is not the true parent, but merely host to her child, as a stranger is to a stranger. True parentage is thereby apportioned to the father, that which is in reality always uncertain, never without a certain fictive element, and whose only guarantee is the name conferred through the conventions of kinship. Athena, goddess of technê, cast the deciding vote in favor of Orestes, his champion Apollo, and the new paternal hegemony. We might think that she is a traitor to her sex, but her first fidelity is always to Zeus. The goddess of Athens, like Pandora, has no maternal genealogy of her own, but came forth fully formed from Zeus's head. In turn, she remains a virgin. While she mothers the first Athenian, Erichthonius, he is born from the earth, seeded by Hephaestus, and she serves as the adoptive parent. And that just in ancient Greek usage, it's interesting that the word for adoption in the legal cases is poiesis, not genesis, as opposed to sort of oppose it to genesis. Athena thus refuses all truck with corporeal feminine Genos. Many commenters choose to focus on Athena's intervention in the law court in favor of Orestes as a decisive break from the violent cycle of vengeance represented by the Furies, one that founds a new polity and the possibility of lawful reparation. I see I'm coming towards the end of my time. I wonder if I can skip a little bit here. And maybe move towards the end.
Don't worry about time, Emanuela. Even if it takes an extra 5 minutes, you know, don't feel stressed or anything.
Are we okay? Yeah, I think
absolutely.
I might need another sort of 5 minutes or so.
Absolutely, take your time.
Lovely, thank you. So Andrew Benjamin has called Athena's decision rather poetically a caesura of allowing, which kind of transforms this sort of cycles of vengeance into a kind of democratic political formation, which is in some sense more humane, let's say. But such allowance comes at the price of the violent suppression of Genos in its specifically maternal, corporeal and material dimension in favor of the technical, symbolic, masculine imperative. At the play's close, the Furies are transformed into the kindly ones, Eumenides, to be led back underground beneath the earth as protectors of Athens. Athena admonishes them not to, quote, let loose the drops whose untamed spirit will devour the seed. The Furies are, after all, prone to such liquid emanations. They are described not just as black and foul-breathed, but as dripping from their eyes hateful drops. The Pythia says of their mysterious origins, I have not seen the tribe that produced this company, nor the land that reared this Genos with impunity. At the trial, Athena too raises the question of Genos to the parties. To the Furies, she says, you are not like no Genos of creature ever sown. They respond, we are children of night. We are called curses in our households under the earth. So here I think we see Genos as threat to Genos, as a counter Genos, chthonic, liquid, feminine, abject. Orestes, naturally, proclaims himself an Argive, the son of Agamemnon. This is plain as day, a self-evident truth, artifact of the paternal categorial function of Genos. Aeschylus's suppliant women too makes Genos a central theme, and there it appears strikingly close to race in our modern sense. The Danaids take great pains in their supplication to establish their Argive Genos, belonging as they do to the lineage of Zeus. Doubted, however, because of their dark-skinned appearance, they are suspected of being from Libya or the Nile, and yet there is an excess too to this economy. The suppliant women are escaping the rapacious sons of Egyptian, and as long as they are unmarried, agamos, outside Genos, they remain untamed or unsubdued, adamaton. Genos takes on its meaning as kind, guaranteed by and guaranteeing the name of the father, seeking paternal recognition, but never, it seems, without some kind of remainder or some sort of slide away from that ordained order. So in closing, I'd like to just consider some examples of this classificatory and technical Genos, insofar as these efforts tend to overshoot or overproduce, to generate a disruptive excess in a way that is perhaps best thought of as anti or counter genealogical. In Plato's Symposium, we have Aristophanes' speech, which tells us there is a third kind of sex, a third Genos, in addition to the male and female. This is the androgynon, or man-woman, the androgyne. And in the Timaeus, the receptacle or chora is called the triton Genos, a third kind that must be considered in addition to the couplet of being and becoming, a kind that is mobile, figural, supplemental, excessive, accessible only through what Plato calls bastard reasoning, nothos logismos, another sign that Genos itself has gone awry. Genos in Aristotle refers to genus or species, first and foremost in the classification of animals, but also, as mentioned earlier, in the rhetoric to the gender of words, which are, like Plato's sexes, threefold: masculine, feminine, and neuter. In this case, the word for neuter gender means a vessel, a thing, or object, actually, a vase. As an aside, Aristotle will also refute Hesiod's designation of women as Genos, arguing explicitly in Metaphysics 10 that Genos is a question of form and logos and never of matter. Aristotle himself is, of course, the inheritor of Apollo here. For him, the true parent is the father, transmitting the form and thus the Genos to the offspring, while the mother contributes only the matter. Genos, genesis, natural coming to be, is Aristotle's most persistent metaphysical problematic, explicable with recourse to the mastery and completeness of technê, but always, as I argued in The Feminine Symptom, disrupted by matter's unstable excesses, the necessary accident, monstrous, feminine, symptomatic. As Genos emerges as category, as name, as technique that secures the fixity of things, separated into kinds, families, the guarantees of paternal order, over time, it is invariably accompanied by the generation of an excess, a third Genos that escapes any easy division of either or. The hegemonic or technical force of patriarchal paternity must defend itself against such incursions, but the categories will apparently not settle as two, self and other, kin and stranger, male and female. They are riven by another genos, a counter-genos, fluid, mobile, chthonic, that flows through the blood, through the landscape's rivers, and that flows as nourishment from the mother's breast. The great tragic heroes easily repudiate the breast, with the possible exception of Oedipus, whose crime may now be understood as the gross deformation of Genos. Hector in the Iliad denies his mother's entreaty as she bears her breast to him, crying, "Have some respect for this." And he's just like, no. And Orestes, deadlier yet in the Libation Bearers, refutes the corporeal argument for motherhood Clytemnestra offers him in the form of her breast, and he murders her anyway. And yet this Genos will not be stemmed, as those drops that might yet trickle from the Furies. One might take a final glance at Euripides' Phoenician women. Tiresias, in a terrible prophecy, has told Creon he must sacrifice his son for success in war. He must pour out his son's blood in the chamber where Dirce, the earthborn dragon, was born and serves watch over the sacred spring. Quote, "And if she receives fruit for fruit, mortal blood for dragon blood, Gaia will be well-minded toward you. One must die who is descended from the dragon, the sown men, pure of blood on both mother's and father's side." And I will end it there.
Thank you very much, Emma. That was wonderful. Thank you. Gabriele, would you like now to respond, and then we can start discussing?
Yes, thank you, George, and thank you, Maria, for the very nice introduction. Well, first of all, I just want to thank Emma for this beautiful and original paper. I know it's traditional for commentators to say that they have learned a lot from the papers they comment on, but this is technically true in this case, given my expertise. I mean, not just in terms of content and analysis, but also in terms of approach and methodology. I find Emma's phenomenological understanding of nature certainly challenging for my assumptions, coming as I do from a slightly different philosophical background and immersed as I am in Aristotle's biological metaphysical distinctions from which Emma wishes to some extent to depart. This for me has been a very healthy exposure to some sort of gestalt shift, so many thanks. I find extremely fascinating Emma's attempt to replace the dialectical polarities by which we are used to understanding Greek tragedies, for instance, the one between polis and oikos, with a different one or with different ones, which center on the two sides of the genos, the paternal and the maternal, or on a contrast between, even more intriguing contrast between the masculine genus understood as an artificial construct and the female counter genus, the fluid, natural, and corporeal genus. As I say, I find this analysis fascinating, and I don't wish to challenge it in any way. What I wish to do instead is to make some observations about the way the fundamental contrast between nature and techne is understood in the paper, mainly in an effort to clarify to myself Emma's conceptual apparatus and to play a little bit the devil's advocate here. My main question concerns the notion of techne and the sense in which it is the right notion to be introduced in opposition to the phenomenological idea of nature which Emma wishes to defend, or to take as a starting point of her analysis. Emma clarifies that nature here should not be understood in its biological Aristotelian sense, i.e., as presupposing or even being identical to an essence that can be discovered through philosophical or scientific investigation. In Emma's very clear words, for our present purposes, what I mean by natural are those phenomena that incontrovertibly appear as part of our corporeal existence, those elements of life we share with many other organisms: birth, growth, sexuality, reproduction, senescence, and death, factical phenomena replete with existential significance. One could obviously observe that these phenomena too, birth, growth, reproduction, etc., are susceptible to a biological and potentially essentialist treatment, such as the one, for instance, that Aristotle provides in his biological works. But it's clearly not in this biological light that they are understood here, but rather in the way they appear to us in our corporeal, concrete life, with all their existential implications. If this is the meaning of nature, what's the technê? What's technê when opposed to nature in this phenomenological sense? Since we drop Aristotle's essentialist and teleological notion of nature, we need to drop a similarly teleological notion of technê. Here, technê is not phusis in the sense of the activity of a craftsman with all its teleological implications. Perhaps in Emma's analysis, the only example of technê in this sort of strict sense is Pandora, who is literally a living artifact. But in the other cases that Emma presents, is not technê as related to craft that is mainly relevant. So what sense of technê is relevant here? If I understand Emma's idea well, technê here encompasses a series of practices that, though unconsciously and spontaneously, manipulate and regiment the fluidity of nature understood in this sort of phenomenological sense. And they do so through symbols, words, and names that create artificial structures, such as the masculine Genos, genealogies in general, and kingships. This is shown, among the many interesting examples that Emma presents, very well in the Iliad 2 example, but also more generally in the construction of the Apollinian Genos in the Humanities, which succeeds in suppressing the feminine and corporeal Genos represented by the phusis. I don't know if Emma wished to elaborate here a little bit on Nietzsche's distinction in the birth of tragedy between the Dionysian and the Apollinian, but if she did, I think this is a very interesting elaboration indeed. It must be said, incidentally, but also interestingly, that also the case of Pandora, which is an instance in the first place of technê proper, falls within this broader sense of technê, as their artificial production is a way of separating out, particularizing, marginalizing, stifling the natural side of the Genos and its feminine component. I have nothing against this fundamental opposition, the opposition between, let's say, nature in this phenomenological sense and the manipulative practices that in some sense create an alternative counter Genos, this opposition that underlies Emma's argument. I'm just wondering, and this is basically a request in some sense for clarification, in what sense this is an opposition between nature and technê, and not more traditionally, for instance, an opposition between phusis and nomos, between nature and conventional / cultural constructs, a distinction that is obviously pervasive in the 5th century BC, and so could be used as a sort of theoretical tool. The first thing to observe to explain what I mean in this area is that the notion of nature that is opposed to convention, to nomos, in the sophistic tradition is not the biological or essentialist notion that becomes operative in Plato and mainly in Aristotle. If we look, for instance, at the final myth in Plato's Pythagoras, or to the little that we have of Antiphon the sophist, we may observe that what they mean by nature, and human nature in particular, is not a fundamental set of properties that distinguish us from other organisms, for instance, but rather a cluster of fundamental primordial needs that drive our concrete, corporeal, and pre-theoretical existence. Surely, some of these needs do have a biological basis, and some sophists did not resist the temptation of seeing nature in a quasi-normative way by speaking, for instance, of the laws of nature. But the impression is that in the sophistic tradition, nature is close enough to Emma's phenomenological understanding than it is to Aristotle's normative and scientific understanding. I would surmise that the notion of nomos that is opposed to nature within this tradition is particularly broad. It could be suited, but I'm playing devil's advocate here, to form a contrast with a phenomenological notion of nature. It's true, as Emma observes at the beginning of the paper, that there is a connection between nomos and the customs and laws of the democratic polis in the sophistic tradition. This is particularly clear, for instance, in Protagoras. But the political and social meaning of nomos is not the only one in this tradition, and is arguably part of a larger project that aims to identify everything that is the product of human making, broadly speaking. Take, for instance, the issue of words and names or symbol production, which is central to Emma's understanding of the symbolic and artificial component of the masculine Genos, or the masculine side of the Genos. One of the intellectual missions of the sophist Prodicus, for instance, seems to have been to show how our linguistic practices, grammatical and semantic distinctions, represent a radical and in some sense arbitrary distortion and manipulation of the nature of things. And so a clear instance of nomos. Prodicus is mocked, as is known in Aristophanes' clouds, and is certainly in the forefront of Plato's mind when he raises in the Cratylus the difficult question as to whether words are natural or conventional. And in the dialogue, the word nomos does appear. Prodicus and Protagoras seems to have gone as far as to entertain the bold intellectual project of reforming Greek language by realigning grammatical genders with natural genders on the assumption that grammatical genders are instances of nomos and do not reflect the nature of things, as natural genders by contrast do. More in general, the manipulating and distorting function of language, which may create a reality alternative to the natural structure of things, seems to be a leading theme of the 5th century in general, and the sophistic movement in particular. And arguably, Euripides may be drawing on this kind of milieu in his late play Helen, whose meaning, though, remains rather controversial. This manipulation of reality through language and symbols and names does not need to be conscious or deliberate, but might be sufficiently unconscious, as many of our habits, biases, and prejudices are. Besides, it does not need to be universal, but may express the instinctive interest of certain groups or of a certain gender. What I'm trying to say, just to come to my question, is that there might be a broad, non-political meaning of nomos that may function well as a second conceptual pole as opposed to nature in the dichotomy that Emma wishes to create. Here, nomos includes the creation, especially through linguistic acts, of all symbols and ideological structures that manipulate our concrete, corporeal, and natural, in Emma's sense, existence. It's true that for the sophists, the use and manipulation of language belongs to the sphere of technê as well, no doubt about it. But here, technê is mainly a body of skills that are opposed to our natural abilities insofar as, unlike the natural abilities, are teachable, they are teachable and transferable, as we would say in UK universities. Thus, to conclude my short comments, I would like to ask Emma why she thinks, to say a few more words about why she thinks that technê in particular is the right term in the opposition that she wishes to create with nature. what is particularly technical, as it were, about the conceptual constructions that underlie the creation of the unnatural Genos. Okay, many thanks. Thanks again.
Thank you, Gabriele. I'm sure that Emma will have a lot to say first here, and then we can open the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriele. It's extraordinarily helpful. And, you know, I just have to kind of come clean here and say that, you know, it really wasn't until I received the invitation from this series, Ancient Medicine and Technology, that I thought, oh my goodness, how do I kind of, and then I thought, well, you know, if I think about this opposition within Genos that I'm trying to develop as a phusis technê opposition, what comes to the fore that didn't, because formally it wasn't, technê wasn't a kind of dominating kind of a structural opposition to phusis that I had been working with. You know, as I said, you know, I was really sort of thinking about this idea of kind of hegemony, and sort of imposing this kind of, I guess, you know, much more anachronistic notion, but I fully agree. I mean, I think in many senses nomos is the more natural or the more obvious operative here. But I also thought it, you know, as I worked on this paper for this forum, I was like, well, actually kind of taking technê as an operative term opens up certain dimensions of this problematic that hadn't sort of come to the fore for me before, insofar as you know, for example, sort of thinking about the technologies of animal husbandry, and thinking about sort of the figure of Pandora, and thinking about, you know, sort of these sort of instances in which this symbolic practice, let's say, or customary practice in the realm of nomos comes to take on these kind of technical qualities. And I was sort of curious as to kind of what would emerge if I impose this opposition upon it. But I'm not committed to it as a kind of grounding opposition of the project. So your comment's extraordinarily helpful. And now, honestly, I don't really know the sophistical tradition very well, and I'm very, very glad to get these references from you, as because I do think that as I kind of develop this project, this is a very, very productive territory for me to think further about this this kind of set of oppositions that I'm interested in. But I think, you know, the lens of technê in particular allowed me to think about, you know, there is something, I mean, there is something so polemical about this kind of Greek deployment, whether it's in Hesiod or in tragedy, of this opposition. And I hope that I could bring something out of that kind of the kind of strength, really, of that polemic. And I think thinking about it with through the lens of phusis and technê, in a sense, kind of tends to sort has the effect of sort of sharpening the polemical edges of that opposition in a way that I found productive, but perhaps also has its own limits. So I'm very sympathetic, I will say, to your comments, and embrace them wholeheartedly. I'm not going to mount a big defense. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so if there are any questions, please ask. I don't know if there are any on the philosophical side, because I have a couple of literary questions to ask, but since we're still on philosophical ground, I see Myrto smiling, so please, Myrto, shoot.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for this. I really enjoyed, and I found really interesting and really nice the idea of sort of the male side of Genos being the one really emphasized, but it's actually the one that's most artificial and sort of constructed. I think that's my main sort of, that's going to be my main takeaway, I think. So, but my question is a small detail really in your talk, because you did mention the Timaeus, and you mentioned how this sort of the third Genos emerges. So I wonder what you think about the fact that this third Genos is actually the Hora, which is supposed to be the very female element of the whole thing, and it's called like the wet nurse and all of that stuff. So how does that kind of, because you said something about messing up, and I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
I mean, I suppose I was trying to make this point that this kind of there's a in this classificatory schema of Genos, there seems to be an aspiration to a kind of binary systematicity that it seems to always create a kind of excessive third character. And I think, you've got the binary in the Timaeus of beginning, of becoming, being on the one hand and becoming on the other hand. And, there's this point at which, the discourse must begin again or restart on a new footing, including, yes, exactly, this sort of hidden feminine aspect of the Genos. And I mean, I could only, I think, hint at it there, but it sets up a Genos of the world. We didn't think we needed the mother, but we did. And this is, or the maternal figure in this kind of family romance that gets sort of set up. But also, I mean, it's so interesting because she's the mother and the wet nurse. So she's not just, so she's got the nourishing aspect and the maternal aspect. There's the kind of material aspect of Cora, and the space-giving receptacle, hupodoke aspect of this conception as well. And it's in a sense, it's Genos defying insofar as it's not a self-same, easily knowable. It's and only knowable via bastard reasoning, right? I mean, that word is so resonant to me there, that there's some sort of disruption of patrilineal that is at work in this discourse, that somehow Plato finds he must grapple with. He finds it sort of unavoidable. And perhaps this is a sort of symptom, in a sense, of the technical scene of the Timaeus, which is driven by the demiurgos, after all, the craftsman. So maybe it's a sign of this, again, this sort of operation of a kind of counter-Genos within the attempt to create a static structure of genealogy.
I think you could also read it along the sort of Apollo's lines and say that, the female element, whatever it is merely sort of the receptacle. And all the job is done by the demiurgos, as you said, and and perhaps additional duties of wet nurse, but not sort of not having any actual power in the sort of in the offspring, which is the realm of becoming.
But certainly a kind of disruptive power in the unfolding of the dialogue itself, right?
Yeah, certainly. That whatever is wrong in the world is due to.
I wanted to ask also something. I mean, it's obvious that in tragedy in 5th century, because the distinction between technê and phusis is very obvious. In contrast, I think, to what is happening in the archaic milieu in Homer and Hesiod. But I mean, I totally agree with you that in tragedy, Genos, the Genos, we have like an external Genos that is referring to what this can, what is, it's obvious, and you have referred to Athena's example when she's talking to the Furious, and he says, I've never seen you before. What is this kind of Genos? And then again in the Danaides, Pelasgos is asking for tekmeria, Genus, and with tekmeria proofs, he actually means things that he can see, and he's referring to the way they are dressed, and then what they are. If you have a bow, I would have guessed that you are an Amazon, and so on. And apparently, this type of Genos is referring to exactly to the outer appearance of something, while the feminine aspect of Genos is something that is internally, and it cannot be seen or documented. While in the Homeric, in Homer, and I guess in Hesiod as well, because we don't have this distinction between phusis and technê, Genos, I guess, could be both. It could be on the one hand, it could be eternal and external. Phusis, technê in Homer is described as the eternal potential, das Kennen of a handworker, of a tool, while phusis, for example, we have only once, the term phusis comes only once in Homer in Odyssey 10, and it's referring to them to this plant Moli, and actually the term there describes the way the outer, the form of this plant. Has nothing to do with something internal.
Exactly.
Yes, and I guess there must be a distinction between Genos, archaic Genos, and let's say 5th century or tragic Genos.
I'm not sure if that. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is right. I haven't, I've been so interested in kind of making the connections that I haven't really kind of looked at the kind of distinctions there. But so yeah, I mean, I think that your point that in archaic notions of phusis, I mean, this is exactly what I'm drawing on in my phenomenological account of phusis, is that it is about how something appears. This is the moly plant is described in its appearance, and in fact, this kind of notion of kind of what emerges and what is concealed, and I take very much, a kind of Heideggerian account of phenomenology here, or nature here, sort of thought phenomenologically, insofar as there's always emergence and concealment in the field of phusis, which are occurring at the same time. And I think it's beautifully illustrated by the moly plant, actually, insofar as it has this fat flower coming into, and then this dark black root that's rooted into the ground. And we see the whole structure of it. And yet what we're sort of seeing is a structure which shows us emergence and concealment at the same time. And I think that on the side of technê, there's a different kind of relationship to knowledge, in which everything is supposed to be self-evident. Everything is supposed to be out on the table, that there is no more concealment, right? And I think that perhaps this is an opposition that animates both the kind of the Hesiodic two sides of Genos, or the archaic two sides of Genos, and the classical two sides of Genos.
Okay.
Does that help to answer your question?
Yes, I mean, I thought that there might be a distinction between, but I think we're right. I think I agree with you that it's actually, there's a continuum. I mean, there are actually no difference between archaic Genos and tragic Genos, let's say.
Can you pin down what you would articulate as a distinction there?
Because I mean, technē, and if we are talking about technē and phusis and Genos as related to these two terms, to concepts, in the Homeric society, in the Homeric text, in Homer, these two terms, they don't appear to serve as opposing authoritative examples. And I thought that this might influence the way that Genos is the workings of Genos, while in tragedy it's clear, it's really clear, crystal clear, as you have shown. I think that in Homer perhaps could be not different, but not so clear.
Yeah, I think in Homer, the only clarity is the clarity of the gods, really, isn't it? We've got, yeah, there's a sort of epistemic deferential, you know, mortals never know that much about anything. And that changes. I think that's maybe what changes in contrast to the classical period.
Okay.
Emma, can I ask you very briefly two things about Aeschylus? I have to say that I never really noticed that the phusis are described as syngonon. I never thought about them as a counter Genos, and I really love this idea. So the first question has to do with the opening scene in the Koiphori, which is when the priestess, she comes out of the temple and she's terrified by what she had just seen. And this is a marvelous, you know, opening. And she's obviously, you know, horrified. She's resorting to the conceptual domain of Marvel, etc., etc. And when they, you know, when she, basically what she's saying there is that I can't really say what was that I saw.
Yes.
I don't know if it's a man or a woman. I don't know if it's real or not. And there, you know, I'm just trying to connect this with what kind of counter Genos is emerging, you know, in the imagination of the characters. And there she says something very interesting. The only thing she says that I can compare them to what I know is a painting that I saw a while back. And there she's, you know, the fact that she's referring to art, whatever painting that was. I mean, that's brilliant in the sense of you have a counter Genos, yes, but you know, it's so, you know, ontologically weird that the only thing that it can be assimilated to is the world of art. And this, I think, you know, I mean, you may find it useful. The second bit is because you talked about fluids and you know, maternal and paternal Genos, etc. The second bit comes from the end. It's towards the end of Agamemnon, and it's you know, this wonderful bit of the play where Clytemnestra, you know, she's exalting in how she killed Agamemnon, and there she says something very, very interesting. She says, it's lines 1381 and following, and she says that as Agamemnon, he has fallen and he gasped away his life as he breathed forth quick spurts of blood. And then she moves on to assimilate these spurts of blood with seminal rain. She says, he struck me with dark drops of gory dew, and I rejoiced no less than the sown earth is gladdened in heaven's refreshing rain at the birth time of the flower buds. So basically she's turning it upside down, and she's looking at the blood. She's imagining the blood as some kind of semen, and she says that I'm rejoicing. So there seems to be a kind of very perverse, we seem to be witnessing here a very perverse birth time. And, you know, go figure what that is. So I think that too could be useful for many, but, you know, for the many, many interesting things you said about fluids. You know, what kind of Genos could emerge from this kind of conception moment? Because this is how she describes it.
Yes.
So these two very to avoid the deep philosophical realm, which I'm ignorant of. These are two literary points that I think they tie well with your argument. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, George. Those are really wonderful references. I'm reminded of a scene in Antigone too, with the spurting of the blood that hits. That hits. There's a kind of a confusion of the marriage chamber and the tomb, right? And this is, I think, part of what I'm talking about when I say, I think the subject of tragedy is Genos.
Oh, yeah.
And these deformations in Genos that lead to these kind of and the presence of these fluids in these rooms, I think, speaks to this kind of other dimension of Genos that I'm trying to kind of foreground. So yes, thank you very much for that. I was this is a wonderful point about the comparison of the sort of Sight of the Furies with a painting, and I mean I think there's a way that there's a kind of of course the subject of tragedy is the Danon, right? The dazzling or thaumata, right? These kind of experiences. The Greeks are very sensitive to these experiences, and I do think that in a sense, that the practice of the poets is a technical attempt to embrace and portray. And so I think this sort of there is something in this confluence between the Danon and the technical that is extremely key in Greek literature. That I don't know if people have written on this, but if they have, I would love to read it. But I would love to think more about this. So I really appreciate those points. Thank you. Now, I was wondering if anyone was going to ask me about the cloak, the woven cloak, as a kind of example of a kind of feminine technê that comes to play such a key role in the Oresteia. Yeah, that was I was kind of preparing myself for that question and not sure how I was going to answer it, because I do think there's this sort of really interesting way that kind of there is a kind of techné on the side of the feminine, but it doesn't ever sort of reach the level of a sort of mastery in a sense. It's that feminine techné always stands on the side of a kind of underlaboring. Whether it's kind of winnowing corn, as in the Cora, right? The Cora is a kind of winnower in the Timaeus as well. There are these moments where these kind of feminine technical labors are foregrounded, and of course weaving is such a primary example of this. But they sort of stay at a level where they don't come to the kind of articulation or act or perhaps I don't know, there's a kind of I don't know. There's places, of course, where garments will speak, as in sort of the tapestry garment of Philomena and so on, right? So there are these incredible instances where that kind of techné comes into a kind of narrative, but that's something I need to think about more, I think, in this project. So, just to raise a question for myself.
No, and I totally agree with you on that, and this is, in a way, in a very simplistic way, this is how we could read Aristophanes, right? His women plays, that he's capitalizing precisely on this absence of full mastery on the part of women in tragedy, and but you know, it's really nice to see. You know, I'm just commenting on the paper now how you know, how much importance and how much bearing these very philosophical questions have on tragedy. And as I said, you know, it might have only to do with me, but I never thought of what is going on with the phusis as a genus. And I love this idea about you know, contrast between different genus and not gender, and what, you know, all the implications. So thank you very much, Emma, and thank you very much, Gabriele, for writing a second paper, you know, and not just a response. It was very detailed, and you know, the dialogue was. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. Yeah.
Can I say just one thing, just on the weaving thing? That maybe you could do something with the idea that these female technê come from Athena. Is, like you said, you know, is not a very sort of, you know, her femininity is under question.
Thank you.
Maybe you can do something that way.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
So if there are no more questions, I think we at this point we can wave goodbye to each other till our next meeting at some point next month. I don't remember the date, the precise date. Maria, do you? Or, but yeah, I mean, we will notify you, all those who subscribed and you follow this list. And yeah, thanks again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very nice to see everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you very much, Emma. That was yeah, that was wonderful. Yeah.
I hope it went okay.
Okay, yeah.
I'm sorry.
I thought it was
for going on
very
so long.
interesting. Very interesting.